Hello, and welcome to today's UNDP Development Dialogues event. I'm Henry Bonsu, a broadcaster from the UK and Ghana, and I'm delighted to be your moderator for this session, shifting the paradigm toward people-centered and resilient recovery. It's a 90-minute event in which we're going to take a good look at what recovery should look like in a world of fragility, pandemics, disasters, and economic shocks. Now, all of these can affect countries, destroying livelihoods, food security, education, and health services. So, in such an unpredictable world, how do we help communities and government recover? And how do we measure people-centered and resilient recovery? We'll examine the role of local, national, and international actors and ask, how can we sustain efforts from immediate short-term needs onto long-term recovery and development? Accordingly, this session will also present the UNDP's recovery program and ask how to ensure development and peace interventions start earlier and work effectively to end humanitarian need after a shock. It also aims to present the right financing model for recovery. Our opening panel will showcase how the UNDP and partners collaborate in post-crisis recovery in support of governments and societies, building on experience to offer complex and durable solutions. And after we've heard from our three keynote speakers, you'll be able to pose questions to them through our chat or comment box. And after the Q&A, which will last for about 10 minutes, we hope, you'll go into breakout groups, which will be clearly signposted, and you'll have 4 options: UNDP's value added in short and long-term recovery, closing the gap on recovery financing, employment and decent work sustains recovery, and using satellite imagery for people-centered recovery. So you've got 4 options there. Right, that's the preamble. On to our 3 opening speakers who will examine planning recovery in the context of systemic risks, recovery from multidimensional crisis, Beirut post-explosion, and the UNDP's approach to recovery. But we'll start with Professor Satoru Nishikawa, Disaster Mitigation Research Center, Nagoya University, Japan, who started his career nearly 40 years ago, first with the Japanese government and then with the UN and other international organizations. He notably coordinated the Japanese technical assistance to the countries affected by the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. He also initiated the long-term recovery planning for Tohoku after the Great East Japan earthquake in 2011. Professor Nishikawa will talk to us about planning recovery in the context of systemic risks. Professor, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning and good evening to the participants. My name is Satoru Nishikawa. So let's jump into my slides, please. Okay, I'm going to speak about sustainable development, disaster reduction, and build back better. Next. Here's a list of earthquakes, and you will be impressed how deadly these earthquakes are. But disasters not take away lives. Next. They bring serious damage to the economy. Maybe you remember the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. That single earthquake took away 123% of Haiti's annual economy. And can you imagine what will happen to a country if they lose that amount of economy? Next. In many of the developing countries, the urban area, the metropolitan area, is growing its population. Next. The poor tends to cheap in vulnerable areas. Next. Next. And when there's a disaster, they easily lose their assets and means of livelihood. Next. And they are compelled to live in worse conditions. Next. And next. They become even homeless. Next. And that they are falling into the vicious cycle of poverty. Next. And that will bring social unrest to the metropolitan area. If you go to the country place, next. The degradation of land and ecosystem would bring frequent disasters, and it would bring poverty and social instability, and that would further increase frequent disasters. Next. And we are in this vicious cycle, and how to cut this vicious cycle is the agenda. Next. Next. Let's take a look at Afghanistan. They were green in the 1950s. What is the color of Afghanistan now? A Japanese medical doctor stood up to construction irrigation channels to address the root causes of malnutrition of children in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, he was ambushed to death in 2019. Why did Syria plunge into such turmoil now? Its lack of land use control and water control. Next. Disaster reduction has a lot to do with sustainable development. If there is a repetition of disasters, sustainable growth cannot be achieved. Next. I'm from Japan. Mother Nature is not so gentle in Japan. We have an enormous amount of earthquakes and other disasters. Next. This is a traditional ukiyo-e drawing right after major earthquake in old Tokyo. Next. Modern Japan is still full of tragedies and lessons learned. Next. Here's the statistics on casualties by natural disasters in Japan from 1945 to 2015, and you can clearly see the difference. Next. We had severe damage by series of typhoons right after the end of World War II, when Japan was totally defeated and collapsed. Next. 2 years after the World War II, Tokyo was inundated by a major typhoon. The eastern half of Tokyo was totally inundated. Next. So this typhoon was a wake-up call for flood protection of urban areas in post-World War II in Japan. At that time, Japan was very poor, but we borrowed money from the World Bank to construct dams and water reservoirs. Next. Right after the World War II, we had enormous population growth in the peace period. And this brought numerous social issues. Population growth meant demand for housing, water, food, electricity, and transportation more. And there was a great need for flood control, water resources development, and hydroelectricity. Also, the great demand for housing, industries, and farmland meant deformation of land, and that had a potential risk of disasters. Next. In 1959, a major typhoon hit Nagoya, killed more than 5,000 people. Next. And this was the first epoch-making turning point for Japan to really wake up for disaster reduction. Next. 2 years after the typhoon, a new act was formulated, which enabled investment for disaster prevention. And we were quite successful in decreasing damage from typhoons and flood casualties. Next. The 1961 Act formulated the Japanese National Platform for Disaster Reduction. Next. Also, land use was paid attention. New land use regulations in Nagoya area was enforced right after the Isewan typhoon. Next. There were restrictions on the methods to build houses in the low-lying areas. Next. The Japanese cities faced various disaster risks right after the World War II. The risk of urban fires. Next. The risk of inundation because excess underground water pumping caused submergence of land. Next. Also, the population growth in the metropolitan areas made a very dense population, and it led to various disasters. Next. So disaster reduction is a must for city planning and regional development in Japan. Next. Also, careful attention was paid to the water resources and underground water pumping so as to control the ground submergence and flash floods. Next. Now, when you go to a community in Japan, there are many of these statues or stone monuments which record the previous disasters. And let's question, why did our ancestors leave these historical assets for us? Next. This is a picture in Nepal. Now, they also have record of the previous earthquake in 1934. Why did their ancestors leave these historical assets for them? Next. In Japan, when the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami came, this village of Fudai was totally protected thanks to an enormous water gate which was constructed in 1984 by a very stubborn village mayor, and he stood up to protect his villages and his descendants, and he was successful. Next. There's a famous saying that natural disasters will hit us by the time people have forgotten about it. Next. Okay. Let's talk about people-centered and resilient recovery. Of course, after a disaster, everybody is in a sorrow. And if we can successfully build back better, and if the people can have the sense of satisfaction and assurance and ownership of the future, and if they can imagine that safe and healthy future of their children and grandchildren, that I think is a people-centered and resilient recovery. Next. Now, we have to really reach the people at risk. And the messages to the people and local governments must be easy to understand. Complicated intellectual messages are not well accepted. So that's my message. Thank you very much.
Indeed, for that fascinating address. I could have listened to it for much more time, but we obviously have to be disciplined here. And let me say this: thank God for the stubborn village mayor that you mentioned. Now, to all those tuning in or watching our session today, if you'd like to respond to Professor Nishikawa's address with a question or a brief thought, please use the chat or comment box, and I'll endeavor to put your thought to him if we have time a little bit later on during our Q&A. On to our next speaker, Dr. Najat Roshdi, who is the current UN Deputy Special Coordinator, Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator for Lebanon. Dr. Roshdi brings over 20 years of experience in development and humanitarian assistance and international coordination in conflict and post-conflict areas, including through her latest assignment as Senior Advisor to the Special Envoy for Syria and Director of Peer-to-Peer with the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Dr. Roshdi will address the topic of recovery from multidimensional crisis, Beirut port explosion. Dr. Roshdi, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Henry. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, maybe even good evening. for those who are connecting from areas where it's already the evening. Well, 1 year on from the onset of the of the COVID-19 pandemic, Lebanon is still navigating both the public health challenges and the economic impact of the pandemic. The availability of vaccines and the rollout of the national vaccination plan provides some limited optimism for a return to some form of normalcy. However, the road to recovery in Lebanon remains uncertain, with the country still struggling with rising infection rates and only limited access to vaccines. Let me provide you a bit of a background about where the country stands today, so that can explain better why our approach regarding the recovery after the the port of Beirut explosion. Today in Lebanon, poverty rates are estimated at more than 55% for 2020 and 25% extremely poor, 20% contraction of the economy in 2020 and 10% more expected in 2021. And Lebanon quickly becoming, a middle income country and not anymore a high middle income country by the end of 2021. Increased inflation and the free fall of the local currency against the USD are further eroding by 80% people's purchasing power, obviously seriously aggravating social inequalities and increasing vulnerabilities. Unemployment, particularly among youth and women, is steeply rising amid a sharp decrease in financial support to small, medium enterprises. Food insecurity and chronic malnutrition are increasingly of concerns. Eroding human capital, where more than 1,000 doctors and 800 nurses already left the country. More than 500,000 of children are now completely deprived of education due to closure of schools related to COVID-19 and the lack of internet access and remote areas. Governance issues are of particular concerns, and environment-related goals seems to be forgotten at a time when Lebanon is facing an acute environmental degradation. The horrendous Beirut port explosion had devastating effects on the city's social, economic, and health infrastructure. Around 160 schools, 6 major hospitals, and more than 20 clinics were damaged, while 170,000 residents were affected by the partial or complete destructions of their houses, and more than 300,000 people in Beirut were affected by the impact of the explosion. Widespread structural damage was reported at the port and its surrounding commercial and residential neighborhoods, affecting a considerable number of UN staff residencies and causing, unfortunately, the death of few of their dependents. On the very night of the 4th of August, Beirut port explosion, the UN sprang into immediate action. An emergency operation cell was quickly activated. An expert relief response team were deployed in less than 24 hours from the explosion, and the UN coordinated flash appeal was launched only 10 days after the blast to respond to the most urgent protection and humanitarian needs of 300,000 people affected by the explosion. The pandemic and the port explosion impact have in fact highlighted further the limitations of the current Lebanese economic and social model and revealed the vulnerabilities deriving from weak governance, insufficient economic diversification, and lack of social protection system in the country. All these interdependent political, security, and socio-economic challenges, the COVID-19 crisis, and the multifaceted hardships facing Lebanon compound broader challenges of tensions, poverty, and stability, and undermine previous development gains. This uncertainty called on United Nations system in Lebanon to rethink the way the recovery should be engineered, protect the most vulnerable, and avoid similar crises in the future. To accelerate the recovery and avoid a lost decade, United Nations in Lebanon work started right after the port explosion to develop with the European Union and the World Bank a new recovery framework that creates a new way of working with two basic principles guiding our work. One, inclusiveness with the full participation and consultation with the government, with the parliament, with the donor community, the World Bank, this civil society organization, and private sector. And second, people-centered recovery, where efforts are felt by the people, make a difference, and bring back hope and trust. Looking to support a further equitable distribution of the growth dividend, mainstreaming gender, and addressing the aspirations of youth, providing social protection to the most vulnerable, and expedite the implementation of reforms with the specific design and sequencing to support the country's stabilization and recovery. As we speak, an independent oversight body of civil society organizations is being established, giving civil society a powerful voice and a substantial oversight and accountability role in Lebanon's recovery, which reinforce local ownership while taking into account humanitarian principles and conflict sensitivity to do no harm and leave no one behind. The reform and recovery and reconstruction framework, which is the response to the port explosion, is an 18-month costed response plan that prioritizes what needs to be done to support the recovery and reconstruction of Beirut across various sectors with a conflict-sensitive approach. It includes a call to the government of Lebanon to form a new fully empowered government that can take immediate policy actions to enable a people-centered recovery and undertake critical reforms to lead on the recovery and reconstruction. Its governance body, the 3RF Consultative Group, embodies a groundbreaking new way of working as it is co-chaired by the Prime Minister of the government of Lebanon, jointly with the civil society, including private sector and associations, the European Union as the representative of the donors, and the United Nations, and ensures transparency and mutual accountability. This morning, we had our very first consultative group meeting with high level of ownership and unwavering commitment to ensure strategic coordination, harmonization, and alignment of resources to the 3RF priorities to build back better. Meaning, build back better means with higher standards of accountability and good governance. Ladies and gentlemen, in the onset of an emergency, and particularly within a complex context like Lebanon, a people-centered recovery that focuses on the people and is informed by the people has proven to be the best approach to ensure a quick, inclusive, and equitable response. This requires, firstly, to keep the pedal on emergency as needed and to move to scale immediately to recovery, strengthening people and community resilience to the crisis adverse impacts and support transformation. Secondly, integrating key reforms in the overall response. Thirdly, fostering innovation far from business as usual. Fourthly, integrating measures that prepare the groundwork for reconstruction and sustainable development. And fifthly, a strong prevention agenda to prevent relapse into crisis and not merely preserve peace and security.
Very good.
Ladies and gentlemen, development actors, especially UNDP, play a substantial role in the recovery process. In complex and fragile environments, peace, development, and humanitarian actors must work hand in hand to alleviate the compelling needs of the most vulnerable, while concurrently rebuilding and strengthening national systems and institutions at all levels. This takes and across pillars and mandates to join up forces, leveraging the full expertise, knowledge, tools, and resources of the whole UN country team to come up with a common context and situation analysis to get a common understanding of the pressing needs and priorities, major challenges, and inherent risks, ultimately to work together in a coherent way and develop joint responses that ensures effectively that no one is left behind. Strong coordination is with the partners is a must. Donors equally play a substantial role in this process as to avoid or bridge gaps exist between the humanitarian development and peace responses by providing agile, flexible, and multi-year funding that incentivizes and maximizes synergies between the three-pronged actors. Preparedness is key to a swift management and response to crisis. Contingency planning is an important element to ensure an effective and efficient crisis response in highly fragile and volatile contexts. Readiness is equally important to ensure a rapid emergency scale-up of United Nations entities' support to critical assistance. Coordination, but not only, working together, co-creating together with partners is of utmost importance to ensure a harmonized, synchronized, and consistent response from the onset of the crisis through the assessment of the crisis impact to the modeling of the response, as well as its planning and management. This is
Dr. Rushdie, I'm going
particularly
to have to
relevant.
interrupt you. Sorry, Dr. Rushdie. We are significantly over our time, and I really, really want people to have the chance to ask you and the other speakers a question. So I'm going to have to ask you, as we say in Ghana, to land for now, and with the anticipation of further questions coming a little bit later on. But that was a wonderful and very effective and sobering assessment of where the Lebanon is today with the multidimensional crises, so many things happening, and in fact, slipping back to a middle from a high-income country. So thank you very much, and for stressing it was a people-centered approach, especially with civil society fully involved. So if you would like, and I'm addressing our delegates now, tuning in, to have your own follow-up question to what Dr. Rushdie has said, please use the text or comment box at the bottom of your screen. You can see the ticker ticking a long way beneath your screen. On to our third and final speaker, George Conway, Deputy Director of the UNDP's Crisis Bureau. Now, Mr. Conway has worked with the UNDP and the UN on peace building and state building programs in post-crisis and fragile contexts for the past 2 decades, including in Somalia, indeed in Mogadishu, in South Sudan for the first year following its declaration of independence, and subsequently. Mr. Conway started his UN career in Indonesia on UNDP's crisis prevention and recovery portfolio, including on recovery efforts in Aceh following the Indian Ocean tsunami. And George Conway will address the question of the UNDP's approach to recovery. Mr. Conway, over to you.
Thank you very much, and colleagues, good day, and really grateful to have this opportunity to talk with you, and thank you in particular to our esteemed panelists for their good discussions thus far and putting some really interesting approaches and concepts on the table, and as well to all participants for participating today. Promoting resilient recovery from crisis really has been a core work for UNDP going back many, many years, at least 2 decades, and is currently reflected as a top-tier priority in our current strategic plan. Our work, however, has evolved significantly over time, including in both scope and ambition, and includes a wide range of situations that our program countries experience, including recovering from the impacts of conflicts, from disasters, as well as the broader effects of fragility, social economic instability, and of course, more recently, the COVID-19 pandemic. And indeed, COVID-19 was a wake-up call and has provided perhaps the most challenging and systemic development crisis that we've seen in recent memory. and has led us collectively within the UN and within UNDP to trigger a rethink about how it is that we engage in contexts of recovery and promote longer-term resilience building. In fact, UNDP's role as the UN technical lead in supporting the COVID-19 social and economic recovery efforts has shown that successful recovery must indeed address a full range of social economic needs across economic, environmental, human, social, political, and even security and human rights dimensions. UNDP has worked with UN country teams and program governments at this stage to conduct over 120 social economic impact assessments and prepare recovery plans in the countries that were most hardest hit by the pandemic. And these assessments, when you review them in large, have demonstrated that the pandemic has exacerbated already stark inequalities amongst people, disparities in access to services, and in fact has had a significant impact in terms of eroding trust between the state and society in many countries. And these assessments themselves complement the findings of UNDP's own Human Development Report, which shows that for the first time in the 30 years that we've been measuring it, global human development is indeed set to fall as a result of the pandemic and its social and economic impacts. And as complex as the COVID-19 impacts have been, what we are finding is that the crisis contexts are dealing with a multiple overlay of different types of crises, and that the context in which we operate is rapidly evolving, becoming more complex and indeed becoming more protracted in many cases. And the case that the resident coordinator from Lebanon spoke to is clearly a case in point, where the pandemic has intersected with a wide range of other economic, social, political, and security crises to create essentially a perfect storm of vulnerability. And frankly, our early warning, both within UNDP and within the UN more generally, does show us that the global community will be confronted with more and more of these types of multidimensional crises moving forward, and unfortunately with the risk of greater intensity. And as a result, UNDP's recovery program, as well as in fact our broader conceptualization of crisis and its impacts on human development, needs to change, and it needs to adapt based on this learning and evidence. And so within UNDP, we are going through a process of revising our paradigms, at relooking at our frameworks for how we operate in these contexts, and today's discussion is certainly a part of that. We are right now preparing what we're calling a new framework for development solutions to crisis and fragile contexts, and within that broader frame, a new specific recovery offer for how we seek to support our program countries, their societies and people, in order to not just build back better, but build towards more sustainable futures, and help to propel the journey towards the sustainable development goals that have been threatened by these waves of crisis. And whilst we're still defining the shape of this, and again, we look forward to the feedback today because it does help to direct us forwards, I will outline a couple of key pointers in terms of what this is looking like at this stage. And as was already, frankly, in the framing of this session, and Najat spoke to it, we really do need to increasingly put people at the center of our collective recovery efforts. Our approach has got to be premised on understanding that the impacts of crisis exacerbate existing inequalities, existing marginalization, and existing vulnerability. It makes them worse. It finds what's worst in societies and triggers an even more negative direction. And as a result, our recovery efforts must prioritize inclusive, people-centered approaches that overtly and explicitly tackle issues of exclusion, persecution, and injustice, that find genuine ways to promote gender equality as a core part of this work, and that indeed do reinforce international human rights principles and standards. Now, I've been hearing, I was pleased to hear from Najat, from her perspectives on the Lebanon situation, but I've heard from our own office as well as to how citizens and local communities have led their own recovery processes, how civic groups, neighborhood committees, women's organizations, faith-based groups have all pulled together to support the rebuilding in Lebanon and pointed forward. And again, how these have been supported and engaged by the UN and UNDP. But we have other good examples from different types of recovery efforts. In Nepal, for example, after the 2015 earthquake, we supported the reconstruction of some 27,000 houses, I think it was. But more importantly, we also provided support to ensure that landless households and women who had never been able to actually have land before were able to become actual landowners and homeowners. And this was one way to ensure that we've been focused on the furthest behind and ensured to utilize the opportunity from crisis to improve the resilience and well-being of people. And these efforts also do contribute to building a stronger social contract, rebuild trust where it may have diminished. Second, we need our approaches to be more integrated, multidimensional, and risk-informed in order to build real resilience into longer-term recovery processes. Systemic shocks are no longer a theoretical concern. COVID-19 made us painfully aware of the fragility of our critical systems on which we depend. And given the types of multiple and intersecting shocks that we've been discussing, our support must be attuned to supporting governments and society to better manage a wide range of multiple risks, threats, and uncertainties, to better manage very volatile futures. And this means strongly linking our recovery efforts to approaches on risk-informed development, on prevention, on climate action, amongst others, and to ensure that these are factored into national development plans. There's a very important data and evidence element of this as well, in order to inform better foresight, anticipation of risks, and a better understanding of what works and doesn't based on evidence in these contexts. And in fact, tomorrow, as part of this development dialogue series, we are having a discussion on data and measurement, which will explore these issues a little bit further. And I encourage you to join that conversation as well. Third, our recovery approaches must be increasingly sustainable and green. In the wake of COVID-19, our program governments and countries have been calling for a reset and a pivot to their development pathways. And our recovery efforts after the pandemic have tried to respond to this call, not just to build back better, but to build far more sustainable and resilient future pathways to development, with a strong orientation towards using the crisis as an opportunity to lay the foundations for a green, diversified, and inclusive economies. And we have a number of good examples that I'd be happy to go into in the discussions around how we've tried to do this. And fourth and finally, just to wrap up, and I know I'm running over my time, we do have to focus increasingly on the fitness for purpose of our partnerships. UNDP is a key actor across the so-called humanitarian development peacebuilding nexus. But looking at the complexity of these complexes, and Najat spoke to this, we really need to ensure that we're pulling together whole of system platforms to bring together UN country teams in a coherent way, to bring in broader coalitions of development humanitarian actors. This includes IFIs, development banks, but most importantly, to bring sectors of society together, the private sector, civil society, different levels of government, in far more whole of society ways to address the complexity of current recovery pathways. So, colleagues, it's been interesting to hear from the speakers thus far. I really do look forward to the discussions that are happening next, as well as across our broader series of development dialogues, as we look forward to developing our thinking moving forwards, and helping to find sustainable and resilient futures for the governments, societies, and people that we work with. Thank you very much. Henry, you're on mute. I'm waiting for Henry to come back in to take off the mute.
I was muted there. I should know better. Thank you very much. That's going to be the phrase of 2021. You're on mute. You're on mute. But yes, we brought back Professor Nikishawa and Dr. Rushdie to join you there. Dr. Rushdie, I'm going to pose one brief question for you to give me a very brief response before we go to the breakouts. Can you tell us just a little more about how the UN and partners can ensure people have a say in their own recovery? What systems can they introduce?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Henry. Actually, we have done it concretely, through three different bodies. The first one, the high-level body, the consultative group, the CSOs are representing community-based, association and organization. And the deal with them is that we are putting in place a feedback mechanism where we go back to the communities, we listen to them, we take that back to the consultative group, which is actually the decision-making and the policy-making body. The second thing is that in this consultative group, you have 9 representatives of different CSOs, including, those representatives of the private sector, but also think tanks, influencers and lobbyists and all kind of things, but with the rotation on a rotational basis. So actually there is an effective representation. Last but not least, the oversight body, which is fully independent, really fully independent, actually they will hold all of us accountable, and they will be really the bridge between all of those who are working on the recovery and obviously the voice of the people. Over.
Tremendous. Thank you very much, Dr. Rossi. Sounds like a very robust system that others could possibly use as a template, because in many parts of the world, especially where there's crisis, people don't feel involved. The contract between government and the governed has been broken. So tremendous. Professor Nikishikawa, very quickly to you, what are the metrics for a people-centered and resilient recovery?
Well, I would emphasize that the important thing is that the people who are affected by the disaster or any conflict, they can imagine a brighter future for their children and their grandchildren. And if they are confident that their descendants would be better off, then they would have hope, and they would voice out their concerns, and they would voice out their future hopes. And I'm sure that is the process for ownership by the local people. Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Professor Nishikawa, because if people feel they have a stake in it, they're going to be more involved and there'll be trust. Thank you very much to you, Dr. Rushdie and Mr. Conway. Now, I'd like to invite everybody, all who are tuning in at the moment from all over the world, to move to one of our 4 breakout sessions. You'll find the Zoom links under the YouTube feed, and we're going to have these sessions for half an hour, okay? So you'll have a moderator, you'll be able to hear from some speakers or a speaker, and then there'll hopefully be time for a Q&A. So we've got these 4 breakout sessions. If you migrate to them now, please. And the 4 breakout groups are UNDP's value added in short and long-term recovery, closing the gap on recovery financing, employment and decent work sustains recovery, and using satellite imagery for people-centered recovery. So please migrate to those places now. I wish you fruitful deliberations for the next half hour, and then we can come back, hear what you've done, hear what you've said, and then we'll go away with some messages, hopefully, to inspire us to do good work as we go forward. For now, thank you very much. Now, folks, whenever you see me, you know we're about to come back. I hope you had some fruitful discussions on everything from the UNDP's value in short-term recovery, financing, employment, and decent work sustaining recovery. Yeah, and also not forgetting the satellite imagery, which you use more and more, especially when we're trying to deal with people-centered recovery. We're going to bring back George Conway, the Deputy Director of the UNDP's Crisis Group, to discuss those main points, and also a couple of questions that have come in the last half hour from people who are very keen, I think, on a response. So as soon as we get, I think we've got one more bit of feedback to come in, then we'll be able to bring back George, Deputy Director, and mop up the thoughts of those of you who attended those 4 breakout sessions. Glad a good number of you did. And also we want to look ahead, to look forward to what is going to happen after this dialogue. Excellent. So let's see if we can bring George Conway back. And let's see, George, there's a lot of work for your brain to deal with at this point. I know that you've been looking at some of the thoughts and feedback that's come in. But before we do that, a couple of quick questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
From the EPA, the political agency, for you. He wants to know, what are the biggest challenges currently being developed or currently being dealt with by development agencies and also donors right now to operationalize the development human peace nexus? Briefly, if you will, those biggest challenges.
The development actors within the so-called triple nexus of humanitarian development and peace, I think face similar challenges to the humanitarians and to the peace actors. I mean, on the one hand, there's an issue of collective fluency. We all tend to speak different languages across different pillars, and we need to understand each other's mandates better, what we call trilingualism on this, in order to really find the common space and understand that these mandates are necessary and complementary and must address different angles to the same set of issues. And then unless those work together well, we'll never really get a grip on addressing core and underlying causes of why crisis happens. And specifically for the development agencies, I do think it's a case of understanding that crises, in the way that we understand them, are fundamentally development emergencies. They happen because of failed development. They happen because of governance failures. And unless we're dealing with those issues, we're not going to find a way of pointing countries on different paths and reducing the likelihood and risks of the same events happening again in the future.
I think, George, your answer is comprehensive enough to deal with Rima's question. That's Rima from UNDP Iraq, and she was asking what your thinking was about how the different entities can work together better, pull together better at country team level. Do you think you more or less answered it, or do you have anything else to say supplementary there?
Well, just to add on, I mean, I think some of this discussion happened in the breakout groups. I do think that having a common analysis amongst all partners is a really essential starting place on this. Because we don't have the same understanding, we're not going to be pointing our efforts in the same direction and getting a really joined up, coherent approach there. And I do believe that over the last year, the work at country team level and led by resident coordinators like Najad to assess the social economic impacts in a broad sense of COVID-19 whilst addressing the humanitarian and the health impacts simultaneously got us a whole system understanding as to what was necessary to be done, and then helped us to support program governments to put in place better recovery plans based on better data. And that just right from the get-go joins us up on a common platform and points us in a common direction. And so I think that's been a good experience. And so great kudos to our resident coordinators on the ground for the UN, including Najat and others that have led that work.
Excellent. Now, George, we've got those main points that came through into the feedback sessions or the breakout sessions. So in the UNDP's value added in short and long-term recovery, the takeaway there key really was, what is the UNDP's value added in recovery, technical assistance for capacity and institutional building to assess and monitor impacts of crises and identify what is needed for recovery. I think you can see that probably, or you've seen that particular one. What would you say to that?
I think for me, it sounds spot on, and it's good feedback, and it's one that we need to continue to work through as we clarify and define our frameworks moving ahead. And so again, I think across all of the discussions in the workout groups, it's been very welcome feedback. I know lots of questions have been posed that we'll need further engagements to debate and to dialogue on, and hopefully they'll land us institutionally in a much clearer position on many of these issues.
Tremendous. I can see Professor Nishikawa is with us and Dr. Rushdie. How are you doing both? I'm glad you're still with us. It's been very, very stimulating. George, this one as well. So on closing the finance gap takeaway, the group was stimulating discussion, agreeing that there was a strong need for evidence-based, data-driven and integrated long-term approach to attract development finance in conflict areas. And then a second one, financing in crisis and disaster setting is challenging, and the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated that situation with the contraction of revenues and increasing the debt burden on many countries. George?
Yeah, I agreed, and we're seeing this in evidence on the ground. This really does validate the takeaways from many of our own assessments and joint UN assessments, and the recovery finance aspect is critical and needs to be put in the broader context of financing towards the SDGs. Because we're challenged now. Since the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed back in 2015, the world has never been more off track as a result of COVID-19, and the financing requirements and what needs to be brought to the table, both domestically in terms of domestic resources and in terms of engagement with the private sector and private sector financing opportunities, as well as from official development assistance and humanitarian financing lines. It really needs a rethink about how the system as a whole operates. And so we've certainly seen a lot of good cause to have those dialogues, and they are happening in different fora.
Tremendous. And then the crucial area of jobs, employment. People need decent work and employment. It's fundamental, isn't it, to how we see ourselves, a reason to get up in the morning. And that's one of the key things that came from the employment and decent work. I was going to call them a task force, breakout group. I mean, that's pretty clear, isn't it?
No, for sure, and it's also questioning of who's being targeted. Those, again, like I said in my comments, those that were marginalized before the emergency are even greater at risk. So in our targeting and working with communities to find who do we need to engage the best and the most, but also with the right types of jobs. I mean, increasingly focusing on green jobs that contribute to the green economy. Lots of good work being done on a livelihoods basis to expand, solar localized energy grids. They're not just things that help to employ people and gain them a decent salary, but the things that actually help to bring societies forward in terms of a sustainable development pathway.
And then the final bit of feedback came from the using satellite imagery for people-centered recovery, so UNOSAT. I suppose this is something we need to do more. The technology is there. It's incredible just how detailed those images can be and just how much they can show us. And in that group, they talked about it allowing a more rapid, accurate, and detailed recovery planning and monitoring. And again, that's something that you in the UNDP want to see more of an access more of. Yes, the expertise, George.
Agreed, absolutely agreed. I mean, we've seen such a rapid escalation in our available technologies just in recent years that the quantity of different types of data that we have to work with is just phenomenal. And we need platforms to ensure that data is coming together in ways that are usable by decision makers, that are really assisting program countries make better decisions, do better prioritization, utilize scarce resources in the wisest ways. And we have the capability now, and it's about getting the right systems in place to harness that and point it in the right direction.
Excellent, George. I'm going to give your brain a rest now, just for 2 minutes, while we get a couple of closing thoughts from Professor Nishikawa and Dr. Rushdie. First, Professor Nishikawa, I mean, you've been here for the entire session. I'm delighted you have been. So what are your closing thoughts?
Okay, I would like to emphasize the importance of solidarity. Solidarity among the communities, in the community, especially in the COVID crisis. Yeah. Because some, especially the most unprivileged group, are in difficulties.
Yeah.
But we have to lend hands to them. Solidarity is the key. And if the community at large have the hope for the future, that would give us the right exit from this tunnel. Thank you.
Tremendous, Professor. And Dr. Rushdie, your closing thoughts.
Well, I would say that not investing in the recovery has a much higher cost than investing in recovery, and everybody should remember that whenever this is addressed. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Over.
Tremendous. Thank you very much. And George Conway then. Okay, so this is a development dialogue. I'm very pleased with the level of engagement and the quality of the contributions. I hope you are too. And I want you to send us away with hope in our hearts and a determination to build back better for the next dialogue.
Great, thanks. I mean, UNDP has been supporting a series of development dialogues over the past month and going forwards for the next 3 months. It has been a phenomenal broad opportunity to hear a wide range of perspectives and visions and aspirations and hope for the future. It's been such a tremendously difficult year for global human development, with the setbacks that we've referred to throughout this discussion. And we have an opportunity to do something different. We have an opportunity not just to focus on the nuts and bolts of recovery, but to really help to point countries and societies, and in fact, the global commons in a direction towards resuming a much more sustainable and resilient path. The fault lines that the pandemic demonstrated and how it intersects with other types of vulnerability make clear that we have to do business differently. And across both this dialogue today, and tremendous thanks to the panelists, to Professor Nishikawa from Nagoya University, to Najat as a resident coordinator in Lebanon. Really appreciating your contribution to this discussion. Likewise, for those that led the breakout sessions, Pat Johnson from the government of British Virgin Islands, Frederico from ILO, Catherine and Gail from UNDP. Thank you for shepherding this discussion and helping us to glean the insights that is being put on the table, because they will help us do better collectively. We do, UNDP and the UN as a whole are working with partners to define a bold vision moving forwards for how we can get the world back on track towards the Sustainable Development Goals and beyond, and use this not just as a pivot point, but as a leapfrog opportunity to really jump forward in coming back from the pandemic. And these types of discussions really help us to think differently about how do we make that work in practice. So just from my perspective, tremendous thanks to all. It's been a really interesting opportunity. Henry, great thanks for the really good facilitation. And colleagues and all, I hope to see you in future sessions of our development dialogues over the next months.
Whether that's virtual or in person. Thank you very much, George Conway, and to all the other speakers. That concludes today's development dialogue. Till the next one, stay safe and well. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.